Well, thank you, Stephanie and Adam, for joining me in this conversation about how to talk about sensitive topics in history. I'm Tammy Morrow. I'm a veteran teacher for Great Hearts Academies and the Dean of Pedagogy for Anthem Prep.
And I'm Stephanie Shanakan. I teach at the University of Maryland. I'm a professor of ethnomusicology, which means I study music and culture. And I also study African American history and culture as well as music. And I have spent some time working with Adam on our project called Race and the American Story, which we started at the University of Missouri. And we have continued to work on this at our various destinations where we are now, and we're really proud of the work that we've done in this area.
And I'm Adam Seagrave. I'm Associate Professor of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, and co-founder and co-director with Stephanie of the Race and the American Story Project, which we founded when we were at the University of Missouri together.
Thank you. I'd like to begin our conversation talking about language. At Great Hearts, we start teaching about the Civil War and the American history in middle school and continue on into ninth grade, our ninth grade Humane Letters course. And there are several challenges that meet a teacher in the classroom, but one of them really revolves around the appropriate language. So I'd like to ask you, how do we talk about slavery in the classroom? How do we speak about slaves? Should we use the term enslaved persons, slaves, enslaved Africans?
I love that question because language is really a great place to start. Language allows us to see where we can start making an effort. And language is part of culture, and culture evolves. And so our language should evolve as well. In terms of the language and the terms that we use for African Americans who were brought over to the United States as Africans, we've come to terms with the fact that slave is no longer acceptable. And the reason is, and historians have thought this through for us, the fact is that the term slave connotes a fixed existence, right? So a slave is a slave is a slave. When we switch, when we evolve that way of referring to Africans that were brought over against their will by other people, we allow ourselves to rethink that term. And so thinking of the term enslaved really is a better way of referring to these people, because it reminds us that this was an action that was meted out on a group of people by other people. It brings all the players into the picture. So I would certainly encourage the use of the term enslaved to refer to Africans who were brought over here. But language is really critical.
Yeah, I completely agree with the importance of language. I think it's a really good point that our language reflects and also influences our thought, the way we think about things. And it's important that we think rightly about things, and more particularly that we think rightly about human beings and what it means to be a human being. I think that, as Stephanie said, the term slave on its own reflects a fixity about the status of being a slave that is just not correct from the perspective of understanding what a human being is. That to be an enslaved human being is like being a floating rock, that it's not a natural state for a human being, that we are naturally free and should be able to live our lives freely. I think that the term slave misrepresents that. So it's better, as Stephanie said, I think, to use the term enslaved to reflect both the fact that that's an unnatural status for human beings and an unjust, wrong status for human beings, and the activity of enslavement that is the other side of the status, right? That there's somebody actively enslaving, even if you are not yourself the person going to Africa to kidnap someone from their home, even if you're the Southern slaveholder, right, who inherited their enslaved people, that you are actively enslaving these people, even if that's the case. So that, I think, is an important thing to, a way in which our language should reflect accurate thinking about the status of slavery.
And like you said, our language is always evolving. Can you give us some guidelines to help us determine what language will be appropriate?
I think that it's important that when we're referring to human beings, I think one guideline is to use the term person or people as much as possible, and that we don't refer to human beings the way we would refer to things, right? So like slave is sort of like a thing, dehumanizing. I think we have to be very careful in that our language never dehumanizes a person by referring to them in the way that we would talk about an inanimate object. I think that's a good general guideline. I think that when possible, I think it's good to refer to people by their nationality or ancestry, and also to ask them about how they are, identify and are comfortable being referred to. I think if you're genuinely curious about that's always an acceptable thing to do, to talk to somebody about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Stephanie, what do you think?
I mean, I would agree with that. I think also one sort of general guideline around this question would be to remember that it's not fixed, right? That language will continue to evolve. If we think about the ways in which even African Americans have called themselves, right? Starts, with one word, it evolves to different words, and hyphenated words, right? From Afro-American to African American to Black, back to African American. So I think the key here is to understand that certainly humanizing is important, leaning into how people want to be referred to, whether it's in our current condition where we're thinking about pronouns and things like that. But it's also to recognize that these things are going to shift, right? And that people can change how they think about how they're called, what they're called, and how they are referred to. So I think those are things that, as professors, as teachers who have so much interaction with students, right, from all kinds of backgrounds, that we understand that these things shift, that nothing is set, and that we should be attentive and ready to shift along with society in ways that, again, humanize people.
So with that in mind, can you give us a little bit of wisdom? What are the acceptable and preferred terms that we should use in our classroom for Black Americans?
Great question. I would certainly continue to use African American. There are a number of African Americans that would prefer to drop the hyphen, because why should they be hyphenated when others aren't, right? American, Black is considered acceptable by many Americans. But I also want to introduce the idea that there are a lot of Black students in our classes who are not African American, right? Who are African, whose parents moved here and identify as African. And in some ways, that's so ironic because they are really African and American, right? But I think African American is still an acceptable term for the most part. I think also that teachers and professors should not assume that everyone wants to identify in a certain way. It's work. It's an effort, right? It is an effort and it's work, and that's what we are called on at this time to do, and be ready again to shift and hone what we say at all times.
And I would just add to that I've had friends ask me particularly about the term Blacks. Mm-hmm. Is that okay to say Blacks? And you hear that still, I think, often. And when I was talking to this friend about this, because he just wasn't sure, right, and it had confronted him as a potentially an issue that he had used the term Blacks. And so I said, well, I think it's not appropriate to say Blacks, because that, to my mind, it is dehumanizing. I mean, there's historical references there as well in terms of the way in which people were referred to in the pre-civil rights era, and when there was a tendency to look upon people of other races more as things that you don't associate with, right? Not as other people, as fellow human beings. So I think the term Blacks tends to be dehumanizing. So if it's plural, I think it'd be better to say Black people, or a black person, right? Not a black or blacks, I think. So that's one area that I think not everyone is aware of or sort of thinks about, but that I think is an important point for the use of language.
I think too, Tammy, in written form, there is a difference too between black with a capital B and black with a small b. Different scholars, they side with one or the other. I always capitalize my B in black, and that's sort of a choice that I make as a writer. I would say that the most important thing is consistency. So Adam and I co-write a book, and we want to make sure that we are both using the same conventions when we are using the word black, whether it's a capital B or a small b. And then what do we do with white? So these are choices that we as scholars have to make, and hopefully the editors are on our side. But these are very deliberate choices that we make given the context and given the fact that we want to reposition the ways in which African Americans have been referred to throughout history.
I'd like to continue talking about language, but switch from history to literature. In our middle school and in our high school, we read a lot of literature that contains racial slurs. For example, in 6th grade, our students read Tom Sawyer. In 8th grade, they read To Kill a Mockingbird and The Merchant of Venice. And then in 9th grade, we read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In Huckleberry Finn, the N-word is mentioned 219 times. How do we deal with the N-word and other racial slurs in literature in a manner that acknowledges the dignity of every student?
We recognize that a lot of the canon, which is steeped in history, has some problematic terms that have been used, like the N-word. What I would say is that when, as a professor or a teacher, we are reading aloud, or we're introducing a book like Huckleberry Finn, we should first of all have a preface, an introduction that allows our students to know that it's coming, right? It's there, it's in the text, it's in the book. But when we're reading it out loud, I would say for the N-word, stay away from it. Do not say it out loud. It is too triggering to a group of and it should be to all of us, right? But certainly to African Americans because of the painful history that has been associated with that word. So that's kind of where I would what I would say about those texts. Those texts are good, and it's a similar question when we think of music as well. There are some old American folk songs that have some very problematic words in them. I won't mention what they are, but there are, and but those are not in the canon, so we can just we can kick them out. But books by Mark Twain and other great American writers should still be read, but they should be read with a full understanding of when they were written, what were the issues about American identity at the time, and we should never re-say that word, because in 2022 or 25 or whenever anyone is watching this, they should know that we've come a long way.
I would just add to that I think it's important that students and teachers don't view the N-word simply as off limits or as it's just a prohibited word and leave it at that. It's not a bad word or a profanity in the same way that other bad words are profane, right? It's not like the F word, the S word. It's a different kind of thing. So I think, as Stephanie said, it's very important for teachers to talk about that prior to reading these texts and to talk about why it is that we don't pronounce the N-word, why we don't say that. And part of that is to look at the history. And as we said earlier, that language is so intimately connected with culture. and with the way we think about things, that it's important to understand the role that the N-word played in that historical, cultural context and the way in which it enforced, reinforced, and really distorted the thinking of people to such an extent that they were treating these other people as non-human things, right? That to really understand the role of language and of that word in that historical context of dehumanization, I think that is a better way of doing it than to just say it's off limits, we're not going to talk about it, right? There's more to it than that. It's important that that context is given.
And could you give a little bit of a script for the teacher, she's looking at her 6th grade students, they're 11, 12. How do they present that? How do they say what you just said?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important for a teacher of students at that age, particularly to distinguish between the N-word and other bad words, right? Kids know what bad words are, that they're not supposed to say them in the presence of adults at least, right? But as kids know that bad words are prohibited, but not for reasons that they necessarily think that they themselves are convinced of. So I think it's important to say, look, students, the N-word is not like other bad words. This is the function that it played in society, in earlier American society. And what it did was it misled people into thinking that these people were not people. And that's a really, really seriously wrong thing that we should always be careful to not do ourselves. And so that's why we're not going to use this word.
Keeping in mind, too, that so many of their classmates have had parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who were called that word. I have had that word called out at me. So I would, again, ask students to think about what that experience may be like for the people who are at the butt of this slur. It's similar to other slurs, right? Think about what that feels like to be told by your great-grandparents how you were treated when you were called that word. So it's all about, it's really, I think for a teacher who has to introduce this to children or to students in different class levels, I think starting with empathy is a great way of starting the conversation about the language that we use and the language that we don't. It is about thinking about or asking them to put on a different pair of shoes and see what that would look like. And then the students can then take that home to their parents or their grandparents. That's how I think we start shifting the society from these moments of empathy that we can provide in our classrooms.
We also use image often to teach history, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And I think it goes right along with this idea of empathy. Image evokes a certain emotion in us. So a teacher in a middle school or a high school class might show a painting or a photograph that depicts a historical event, or for more recent events might even show a brief video clip that shows actual footage of the event. But often, images from the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement are violent and graphic. So how graphic should we be? How do we teach things like the Jim Crow era, the lynchings, or even the Ku Klux Klan to children? What images can we and should we show to children?
I think that the first point there, I think it's a great question. The first point is that we should never avoid talking about slavery and historical injustice in the United States because we're afraid of traumatizing children, in the sense that we really can't teach about American history without teaching about slavery and without teaching about other historical injustice. You just can't do it. So I think that's the first point, is that we shouldn't excise those topics simply because they involve difficult issues for students to process. That said, I think at the younger grades, it may be more important to prepare students in terms of their knowledge and understanding verbally and in writing and in other ways, conversation about the context of this topic and these issues and what happened in American history, and to introduce graphic imagery as students get older, when they have that background of knowledge to understand, to appropriately process what they're seeing, rather than to just be shocked. I think that it's important to awaken the sort of conscience and moral sense through imagery, but that it's also important that one be prepared to process it appropriately. So for that reason, I think that you talk about all of the injustices in American history as early as you're talking about American history with students and reading about it and discussing it, but you don't necessarily introduce graphic imagery until students are a little bit older, would be my recommendation. But
I mean, I agree mostly with what Adam said. I understand, I know that those images are stunning and startling and depressing and so painful, right? And this is where we really start understanding how difficult our jobs are as educators, right? Because we know that we're not educating tables or chairs. We're educating human beings who have their own backgrounds and their own family histories. And so my answer is going to be a little bit complicated because I understand what Adam is saying and I agree, but I think there are two things here, right? I think one is that we've come far in this country, but we haven't come far enough. We know this. And so the question I always have is why? Why aren't people more moved? Why does it take a public killing or murder of a black man or a black woman for us to say, okay, we need to do something, And the answer I always come back to is that people are not moved because they're not close enough to the problem. George Floyd was a moment because we all watched it. We were all in quarantine, we weren't distracted, and we were watching it. That was an image. It was an image on television that people saw 4 minutes long, right? Or however long it was. And suddenly the society was moved. So how do we get moved? We don't get moved by long lectures or long books. We get moved by things short things that we hear, short things, and that's why Twitter is such, or Snapchat and so on, are so brilliant, because they move people to do things or to think in a certain way. Brilliant, but problematic, of course, right? On the other side, though, myself personally, I find it very difficult to watch films about slavery, to see images of lynchings, because I look up on that tree and I see someone that looks like my husband, or someone that could be my brother, my great uncle, someone that is from my family line. So I can imagine a kid in a class like that being subjected, like you want the kids to all see it, because maybe they're moved in ways that we haven't moved the society in the past. But at the same time, we know that those images are going to deeply hurt a certain group of students in our class. So what do we do with that? It's none of these answers are like clear-cut, right and wrong. And this is why your work in pedagogy is so important to any school district, Tammy, because you really have to think through all these angles, think about who these students are in your class, and think about what is the impact at the end of the day that we're trying to get to. So yes, an image of a lynching is too much for a kid, but it's always been too much for a kid. So is there a middle ground? Is there a way that we can start introducing these things, introduced properly and with a lot of preparation, so that the trigger that's coming is not is not debilitating. I think kids in our classrooms now are different from kids, and I can see it in the college class. In the college class, kids who are coming into our college class now have a deeper understanding of race in America than when I started teaching 20 years ago, right? So I think that we have to factor all of that in and consider where we want to go with what we're presenting.
I think what Stephanie said is very important. And I think that the two things that you described, on the one hand, we have to have knowledge, right, of what we're seeing, of the context, the history, but then we also have to be moved to act. And I think it's very important to see those two as different things, and that as things that need to go together to move our society forward in the way we think it should be moved. And of course, our students are the people who are going to be affecting society in the future, and we're preparing them for that. And so, yeah, however that comes down in terms of precise guidelines from the standpoint of pedagogy, I think that the way Stephanie put it is exactly right, that it's important to know what's right and to know what's correct and accurate and true about history and about ourselves. And then it's important after that to be moved to act on it, because too often we have knowledge without being moved to act. And if we are moved to act without knowledge, that can be a problem as well. So I just think that's really important.
So let's say the teacher's looking at the picture and wonders, is this appropriate? Is there a question that one can ask? Could I say to the teacher, ask yourself this question in order to determine if this is going to move in the right way?
I think that something Stephanie mentioned about the composition of the classroom might be a consideration when you're looking at that as well. I mean, who are the students in my class, and what is their background and their identities and their ancestry and families? You know, how will they process this, right? Because different students will process it differently on that basis. So I think that's an important question that teachers, good teachers will know. They know how individual students might react to these things. And then I think, secondly, to ask themselves, what have they learned in the classroom and maybe in previous years that will connect with what they're seeing? And have they learned enough to contextualize and process what they're seeing?
Agreed. I've been thinking about this question a lot, particularly when we think about there's some music out there that maybe is too hard. For example, there's a song by Billie Holiday called Strange Fruit, which is very graphic. But the way Billie Holiday sings it, it's sort of, it gently brings you in. It gently introduces the history of lynching in the South. She's got a beautiful voice. Her articulation, the musicality of Billie Holiday allows that to land on ears gently. It's only when she gets to the very last, the last phrase really, that becomes a little bit harsher. Other people have covered that song, and it's certainly a lot. It goes hard the whole time, but Billie Holiday does it in a way that pulls people in. So I bring that up because I've been thinking a lot about images. I have a colleague who studies images of lynchings. He's a white man, and he does exhibits of these images, which are very hard for me to look at. But they're important. But I know that it's hard for a lot of people. I wonder if, for example, a teacher looks at an image, is there a way to bring the Billie Holiday to it, right? Like, is there a way to bring a silhouette of the image, so that you're not, especially kids who are younger, that they see a tree, they see an image of a human being on the tree. It's important, but they don't see sort of the graphic images. I think it's also important to zoom out and see the people who are watching this. Too often we see just the tree and the body. But do we zoom out and see that families are there with children picnicking at these events? That's a tough thing too. But that's part of the truth, right? That's part of the history. And we often don't look at what's in the background. It stuns me that families would take their children to watch this, that kids would be playing jump rope while that is happening. But this is the truth of what it was. History is interesting because we like to sort of pick and choose what we want to share, what we want to present to our students. So I would say certainly zoom out, show the full picture, but also maybe there's a way to bring some kind of silhouetting or something in that sort of allows a gentle landing. We want it to land. We want it to land well, but we also don't want to completely switch it off. I always say that if we run too fast, the train is just going to go off the tracks and we're not going anywhere. And that's one of the things that Adam and I really think through as we think about Race and the American Stories, that we want the train moving in the direction. I know there are lots of my colleagues who would like us to go much faster, right? But I don't want to get that train off the tracks. I just want us to steadily but deliberately move forward.
I love that, to bring the Billie Holiday to the image. Maybe that's the question. How do you bring Billie Holiday to this image in a way that the students can land well? And thinking about the particular people, one of the ways that we teach history at Great Hearts is through the individual story of a narrative of individual people. So I'd like to focus on that a little bit, and how do we teach controversial figures? For example, how do we teach Robert E. Lee? How do we portray his story appropriately and truthfully without lionizing or demonizing him?
Well, I think that this question relates to some other questions about how do we teach about the American founders, for example, and these figures in history. And I think that the first part of the answer for me is that we always have to be careful about teaching what I call the Mount Rushmore version of history, which is where we just pick out these individuals who we then sort of take out of their context and either, as you said, sort of lionize or demonize, right? We think they're gods or they're demons. And when in matter of fact, of course, the history is always more complicated than just being moved by one individual, right? And so I think we're taken away with these individual stories in a way that teachers should ensure to counter in students, that these people are part of a context and a history that was bigger than them, and that they were people who might have had virtues and vices and positives and negatives, did good things, also did bad things. I think that that's important. And part of that is putting students in the context of the history, that these were people at the time. They weren't figures on Mount Rushmore. And in the case of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders in particular, I do think that it's important for students to understand what the Civil War was about, and the fact that this was an unjust war that these people were leading and taking part in. And it's important to understand that and to contextualize it appropriately. That Robert E. Lee and other Confederate generals, they were fighting against the United States for an unjust cause. And it's difficult for some people to think of it that way because it's a civil war, right? These were people that were part of the same nation. But I do think that it's similar in many ways to foreign enemies and to leaders of foreign militaries that we fought against in the past, that they're people, they're human beings, they were human beings, but at the same time they were engaged in unjust warfare against our country, and that's a very seriously bad thing. There may also be a distinction to be made between leaders in that conflict, like Robert E. Lee, and ordinary on-the-ground soldiers, right? The hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers who died. And And to say that for someone like Robert E. Lee, it's more of a conscious decision to fight for a cause and against the Union than it was perhaps for some Confederate soldiers who were brought into the conflict because of their families, defending their families or their land or however they thought about it themselves, who maybe weren't slaveholders themselves and had no connection to the institution. So I think there's a difference there between the leaders and the ordinary participants as well.
Yes, the fact is that Robert E. Lee was head of the Confederate Army, and had some, he was also a father, a husband. He's a human being, for sure. As Adam said, an unjust cause, from my perspective, and I think from any reasonable human being would agree that slavery is not a good thing at all. Enslavement of by one human being over another is there's nothing right about that. So I really agree with the idea of bringing nuance to these figures in American history, bringing nuance to understand what they were fighting for, what they stood for, and so on. I would say also on the other side, on the Union side too, the founders, right, were, some of them owned slaves themselves, and we need to factor that in too when we talk about these quote unquote great men. And I would also mention here, Tammy, that we need to remind ourselves that those Rushmore figures, there's no woman up there, right? So who are the other great names that we should be adding to our list of iconic Americans, whether it's Robert E. Lee, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, who are the women that have had great input in the evolution of the society? We should include that as well. So I think the question is a great question for considering leaders of the civil rights movement. It's a great question for considering leaders of feminism. Where have they fallen short, and what have they contributed to the progress of the society?
So I'd like to circle back to some of our founders and talk about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who actually owned enslaved people.
This comes back to something that we said with Robert E. Lee, right? Which is that we need to draw out the threads of nuance for these human beings, right? They were human beings, complicated human beings like all of us are, that evolve and change and have thoughts and revelations and so on. But I think every time we come back to Thomas Jefferson and the fact that he owned slaves, we sometimes will hear folks say, well, he was a man of his time, everybody else was a slave owner, therefore we should excuse him for that. And I hear that a lot. However, when you go to the Notes on the State of Virginia, which he wrote, so these are his thoughts and his words. Even though he was a person of his time, he did put his thoughts down on what he thought of Black people. And it is damning evidence of this founding father. We include it in our curriculum because we think it's important to, again, get the full picture of these complicated icons in American history. But every time we get to the Notes on the State of Virginia, we have to stop and have long conversations about Thomas Jefferson and these terrible things he says about Black people. He compares them to animals, there are many things. He talks about, their skin and their physique and the fact that they're not very intelligent. They certainly don't have the intelligence write poetry. So he's doubting Phyllis Wheatley in this book that he publishes. He's doubting her intellect, as well as the intellect of all Black people. He is considering where they should go when they're freed. Certainly they could be freed, but they shouldn't stay here and mix with us. They should be taken out and taken somewhere else. You know, he refers to Black men as being sort of these pathological sexual beings who, it's problematic in so many ways. It's often very difficult to get through the notes on the state of Virginia. But this is part of who Thomas Jefferson was. I don't think that we should dismiss that.
That's right. And we also teach the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson is acknowledged by most people to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. He put it on his tombstone. But when I teach the Declaration of Independence, I actually, largely for the reasons that Stephanie just mentioned, I like to emphasize the fact that the Declaration of Independence was authored officially by the Second Continental Congress and not by Thomas Jefferson, that he authored a draft of the Declaration of Independence, which was then revised and adopted by the Continental Congress. And actually in that draft, Jefferson has this long paragraph condemning the cruel horrors of slavery. And it's very difficult to reconcile the terrible things that Jefferson did in his life as an enslaver, and the terrible things he wrote in the Notes on the State of Virginia, his reflections on racial hierarchy and difference. It's hard to reconcile that with his apparently vehement condemnation of the immorality of slavery in his draft of the Declaration of Independence. So he was a very conflicted, certainly, figure in those ways. And I think that Jefferson, in his example, highlights for us the tremendous distance and gap between the ideals that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents and the reality of racism and racist enslavement at the time. And I think that we don't even have to try immediately to encompass that with our minds, but more so to just really understand both sides of that gap and both poles of that tension, and to reflect on that. I think that is a useful thing to do, and to not de-emphasize the one or the other. Don't allow the importance of American founding principles to overshadow the enormity of the evils of enslavement. But also, I think as well, don't allow the enormity of the evils of enslavement to deny the truth of human dignity that is expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So I think that's important. And Jefferson himself, in many ways, embodies that tension.
And I think that tension is difficult for us. It has always been difficult. I know when the book that exposed Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and the ways in which he had a African-American woman who was enslaved, who was very young. That the way that historians reacted to that book is a great example of the tension, that we want to see him and think of him as in only one way. And when we are confronted with other truths about who Thomas Jefferson was, we want to preserve the first picture. And that's the first picture is never the only picture of any of us, right? I'm sure that we can pull up some interesting pictures of Adam or myself, right? And all of those pictures are true, you know. And so this is the tension that we deal with in bringing Thomas Jefferson in all his pictures to the table. Robert E. Lee in all his pictures to the table. John Brown, you know. I mean, all these names in American history. Martin Luther King, right, in all his pictures, not just the monument, but also everything we now know about Martin Luther King, the people that were Bayard Rustin, like all these people that he was surrounded by, that give us a fuller, truer picture. The tensions are there. We don't like those tensions, but we have to get in there as academics and help our students parse them out.
So I would love to just shift back a little bit, get a little bit broader perspective, and start to talk about other controversial debates that were going on at the time during the Civil War. In ninth grade, our students read several texts that highlight the contradictory role that Christianity played in both the establishment and the abolition of slavery. For example, they read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. And Douglass, who was himself a devout Christian, describes in his narrative how his slaveholder would found religious sanction for his cruelty. How should teachers approach the question of religion in both the establishment of slavery and its abolition?
This question of Christianity and slavery is central, and I think it's one that we have to grapple with. I think we consider religion versus faith, right? And we consider how other societies, other peoples have used religion to wield some really terrible things on human beings. And so the United States is no different. There's definitely a contradiction between this notion of the United States as, at some points, the notion of a Christian nation, when indeed parts of the Bible were used to establish those racial hierarchies that exist. I think that Frederick Douglass is a great example of the great irony, right, of Christianity as a faith versus Christianity as a tool, as a really terrible tool used to perpetuate injustices and discrimination and so on. I would offer Phyllis Wheatley as a great example, for example, of someone who, as an enslaved young woman, produced some of the greatest American poetry. But in this poetry, she does. There's a lot of Christian imagery that she references and she repeats again and again. As a way of reminding us that Christianity has been a useful device to actually scale the injustices that have been meted out by that same Christianity, right? So it's an interesting dilemma. And as an ethnomusicologist, I'll come back to music and remind us of a song that many of us know. Amazing Grace is a song that, whether you're in a Black church or in a Catholic church or in a evangelical church, we all know that song, right? But it's a song that was actually written by John Newton, who was captain of a slave ship and had participated in bringing Africans who had been stolen from their villages across the Atlantic all those months when Africans were piled onto those ships. Just an inhumane image, speaking of images again, right, of how people were treated, human beings were treated. And at some point, and again, this was carried through with Christian justification, right, because these people are the children of Ham or whatever the justification is, right? But he was convicted, and this is a great moment to remind us that people evolve and people can change, right? And people can become good and better, right? And so he wrote Amazing Grace as he was reflecting on the great horror of his own participation in the slave trade. I once was lost, but now I'm found, right? It's an amazing story of someone who had done terrible things against possibly thousands of human beings. And that song has now stood the test of time. It was, I was blind and now I see. So this is him grappling with probably Christianity, his own identity, and the identity of the people in the holds of the ships that he brought over. So we have to grapple with this, I think.
Yeah, I think that the distinction between faith and religion is an important one, and the distinction as well that I think of it sometimes in terms of genuine religion versus religion being used for a purpose, serving self-interest. And I think the way Frederick Douglass described it in that quotation you read as giving a religious sanction for cruelty, that in many cases religion is used after the fact to justify behavior that we want to partake in anyways. And I think the story of John Newton is a great one too, an Amazing Grace. And it shows us that genuine religion, in my view, it often prompts conversion rather than confirming what we're already doing, right? That if your religion says that everything you do is just fine and you don't have to do anything differently, chances are that religion was made or is being used to serve your interests or the interests of others, because religions just tend not to do that, right? A genuine religion prompts changes in behavior and conversion, and takes us outside of our comfort zone and what we want to do on our own. And that's, I think, true across the board for world religions of many different kinds, particularly certainly for Christianity in the American context. So I think there is an important distinction to be drawn between a sort of genuine religion or a genuine Christianity, as Frederick Douglass would understand it, that supports abolition, right, the cause of abolition, versus religion serving self-interest, which to my mind is clearly the case when religious arguments and Christian arguments were used to justify enslavement. So I think that's a really important distinction to be used. And actually in the Constitutional Convention on August 21st, there's this debate at the very beginning of that day between Luther Martin from Maryland and John Rutledge from South Carolina. Luther Martin says that slavery is contrary to the principles of morality and religion. And then John Rutledge says that doesn't matter because what we're talking about is interest. That in this question, what matters is interest, not religion or morality. And that is right there in the Constitutional Convention, I think portrays clearly what side religion was originally on before it was used more so in the antebellum era to justify slavery after the fact. I think that's more the truth of the matter than religion being sort of genuinely used to support the institution of slavery.
I think too that along those same lines, thinking about faith and religion and the ways in which religion have been used. If we think about Martin Luther King and that letter that he wrote from the Birmingham jail, I think it's a great way of really putting religion on notice, right? And putting religious leaders who were still doing very bad things, right? Or religious leaders who hadn't had a personal conviction to change. I love what Adam said about, if you're not changing, if you're not evolving and getting better, then you need to check it. You do need to check and see. And the thing that I always tell my children is, what do you think the character of God is? Is the character of God a character that would enslave people or put one group of people over the other, or these are the big questions, right? So King asks the religious leaders at the time, Christian leaders, to think about what they were doing, what they were supporting, where their allegiance lay in terms of progress and goodness and the real values of Christianity. I think that's such a great text that allows us to get to the heart of this question.
I'd like to talk about some of our founding documents. So I'd like to talk about the Constitution first. Our students in ninth grade read the entire Constitution. And when they read Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, we have to discuss the 3/5 clause. This clause is often referred to as the 3/5 compromise. So was this clause just a pragmatic compromise? Were there moral principles at stake on both sides? In other words, how do we teach the 3/5 clause?
I think that's a great, important question. And I think it's important when we're teaching the 3/5 clause to teach both the denotation, if you will, the sort of factual part of the 3/5 clause as a compromise and sort of the negotiation that was involved among the participants and the history of that number and that sort of thing. So it's important to discuss the denotation of it, but also the connotation of it and the symbolic meaning of the 3/5 clause. I think it's important to emphasize both, certainly, and not to let the one diminish in any way the other, particularly not to sort of explain away the connotation and the symbolism of the 3/5 clause as simply the result of a compromise and to get lost in the details, so to speak, without emphasizing the important symbolic significance of the number and of the clause. So as a factual matter, it was a compromise between Southern slaveholders who wanted to count their enslaved people as one whole person for the sake of representation, and Northern delegates who wanted to count enslaved people as zero, right? Not at all for the purposes of representation, because that would, of course, augment the representation of the Southern slaveholders. And so 3/5 is the number between that was used previously under the Articles of Confederation, also to compute in the census how enslaved people would count for purposes of representation. It wasn't a number that was invented at the Constitutional Convention, but it was sort of carried forward from that previous compromise. But the connotation, I think, of it in many ways has been more important and is more important to focus on as stating that, reflecting the fact that these people believed African Americans who were enslaved at the time to be 3/5 of a human being, or equal in value to 3/5 of a human being. So I think that's not in any way, some might say, that's not in any way a misrepresentation of the clause. I think it's an important meaning of the clause. And James Madison wrestles with this in really painful, interesting and painful ways in Federalist Number 54, which is very difficult to interpret. I think he's actually subtly undermining the thinking behind the 3/5 clause, that it really is a problematic contradiction to have that in the Constitution. In my interpretation, that's what he's doing there. But yeah, I think it's important to keep both of those in mind, the factual element as a compromise, and then the connotation and the symbolism as well.
So the two sides, yes, for sure. We with careful and a more in-depth reading of that part of the Constitution, you understand that these are numbers that they're playing with to gain more ground and power and so on. But when you're Black, if you're a Black student in a classroom and you're told first that this is actually what they were doing, and it wasn't really saying that you were less than, it's hard to get beyond that. It's hard to consider or to be magnanimous enough to say, okay, well, it wasn't actually, saying that I was less than, because the fact is that you were still negotiating my humanity, right? You were still playing with numbers on my full human status, right? So what Adam is saying, I totally agree with, and I know him well enough to know that when he says that the focus really should lean towards talking about that connotation, that he means that, right? That we should remind ourselves of how ridiculous that would feel like to people of color, to Black people, to even have that in the Constitution, even though a wider look at it is, it is really about the South wanting more representation, the North trying to skew that, so that in the end, we do have some equality or some gaining of ground in terms of getting rid of slavery. But it's still very hard to hear for a student. I know we teach this part of the Constitution in Race and the American Story, and we've taught it many times, and our African American students, they pause on that one. That's one that we spend a lot of time on, because it's very difficult for them to hear that the founding fathers, or a group of white men, got together and put this phrase in the Constitution, and that had an impact on the personhood of their ancestors. It's difficult.
Just to add to that, I think that's what you said made me think too. Just the mere fact of putting a number, quantitative value on a human being is in itself problematic, very problematic. And the idea that the worth or value of a human being could be measured in that way or measured against other humans, 3/5 versus 1, that in itself, that exercise is a dehumanizing exercise for anyone to have participated in. And so I think it's important to also reflect on that process, I think, itself, as important for students to reflect on and learn about and understand that in itself was problematic, regardless of the numbers. Just the quantitative measurement of human value is wrong. Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about another hotly debated issue in the Civil War. So there are several causes that led to the Civil War, but at the time, two hotly debated issues in the lead up to the Civil War was this issue of states' rights versus slavery. These two issues come into light in ninth grade when our students read Lincoln's first inaugural address, his second inaugural address, and the Gettysburg Address. How do we approach the topic of states' rights in the teaching of the Civil War? What's the proper way to frame the historical debate that pitted states' rights against slavery?
So I think depending on where you live in the United States, you hear all the time that the Civil War was fought because of states' rights, and people like that version of the story. It removes you from the vicinity of guilt, right? It's a better story, but that's not the full story. What were the rights that they were fighting for, right? And I'll let Adam answer this question more fully, because that's his area. But I would say that you cannot disassociate slavery, the maintenance of slavery, from the cause of the Civil War, right? If I could just circle back for a minute, back to language, the importance of language and images, right? That the Confederate flag, for example, is something that is flown very proudly in some states still in the United States. And one of my children was driving behind a truck that had a big sticker that said, "Unreconstructed Confederate." So it was language with the Confederate flag, right? So it was language that she read as a Black girl, right? That she read as conveying that this was, and it was in a rural area in one of the states that is southern.
Unnamed.
Yes, we won't call the name of the state. But what she read in that image, in that language, was that this was someone who wanted to convey that the Civil War should be, that the causes of the Civil War should be rolled back, that we should go back to that point in history, because of course, if we think of Reconstruction, if he's trying to convey that we should be unreconstructed. Reconstruction was a good little window of time, right? And if he wants to go back, then we're going back to slavery. So I don't see how we can talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. But Adam,
Yes.
speak more.
I think I completely agree with everything Stephanie said. I think that's absolutely right. And I would put it even more strongly than you put it, that it's not only that we can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery, but also that it's clear from the historical record that slavery was in fact the primary cause and the main issue that led to the Civil War. And I think there's very little debate about that among historians now, regardless of what some in the South may still think, that really states' rights was a very subordinate issue at the time to the issue of slavery. And there's ample evidence for this. There's the South Carolina Declaration of Secession, which foregrounds slavery as the reason why South Carolina is seceding, because they need to protect the institution of slavery. And moreover, as Alexander Stephens says in the Cornerstone Address, South Carolina mentions this as well, that the original founding on his interpretation and South Carolina's interpretation was hostile to slavery in some way. And so they are seceding and forming this confederacy explicitly to found a country on the truth of human hierarchy and enslavement justified on that basis, racial enslavement. So it's clear from those documents that that's what the Civil War was about. Now, states' rights is a legitimate constitutional issue, but actually early on it was co-opted by the issue of slavery to become really inseparable from it. So during the Constitutional Convention, there's a moment when the states had been divided among each other on the basis of their size, the large states versus the small states. Those were the main voting blocks in the convention. And then there's a moment in the middle of it when James Madison actually tries to convince them the real division between us is not our size as different states. The real division is between slave states and free states, or between the northern and the southern states. And after that moment, the states actually sort of realize, yeah, we think that's right. That is the main division. And so that changes the dynamic of the Constitutional Convention. And then from that point forward, I think the issue of states' rights is pretty inseparable from the issue of slavery. So I think that's, as a historical matter, I think that's the case. And one more point is Lincoln, in his debates with Douglas in 1858, he makes it clear, he says, the real issue in this controversy is between those of us who think that slavery is a wrong and those of us who think that slavery is not a wrong. He says that's the real issue in 1858, and I think that's the issue of the Civil War as well.
Well, we've been talking a lot about empathy, and so I want to come back to that, this idea of empathy or emotions. And I want to share a bit, perhaps a scenario that I've encountered with just speaking to teachers across the network. So here we go. A Black teacher says, I feel like when I teach about slavery and the Civil War, all the white students are looking at me strangely. Or the white teacher says, I don't know how I should teach about slavery and Jim Crow when there are students of color in the room. So what advice do you have for teachers in situations like these?
So having been a Black teacher who talks about this stuff, a white teacher who talks about this stuff, yeah, I mean, we grapple with this a lot. You know, we thought through this when we created Race and the American Story. You know, what does it mean to have someone like me talk about these things, someone like Adam, when we're together as a partnership doing this kind of work? What do our identities bring to the table, right? How does it impact the message of the lesson that we're trying to produce or to communicate? And those are those are real. You know, those folks look at who is singing a song, you know, or who is painting a picture or writing a great book, right? I think the composer matters, the teacher matters, and so these are real questions that are realistic, and we can't. I think what we cannot do is say you are impersonal. You should be impersonal. You should not be yourself. You know, you are just a teacher, because we're not just one thing. We are again, we are human beings with feelings, with backgrounds, and so on. So we bring that to the table when we are deans of pedagogy or a professor and so on. So what I would say is that we should bring that in. We should position ourselves, explain to our students who we are. I often remind my students that I'm Black, but I'm not African American. You know, I'm not, my ancestors were not brought to the United States. They were brought to the Caribbean, but not to the United States. And my father is Nigerian, so my father's folks were never, you know, so I make sure that people understand that I do have some distance here that I've worked really hard to scale. Like I have done a lot of studying, I've done a lot of reading, certainly a lot of writing about this. I've done the work. We can all do the work to get closer in. And we should challenge our students to do that too. So whether you're a Black teacher, a white teacher, a teacher of color from some other ethnicity, we should all say who we are, position ourselves, let the students understand where we're coming from. Are we from Chicago? Are we from the South? You know, and then tackle the subject matter together, right? But I don't see how we move away from being honest about our position and how, you know, the way we teach a certain topic may be influenced by our own background. And I know that Adam is going to say, and the lesson is still the lesson, you know, that the topic on the syllabus is still the topic. So when we introduced Phyllis Wheatley to our curriculum, Adam still had to teach Phyllis Wheatley, you know, and do it as a white male. And I still have to teach Thomas Jefferson and pull out the nuances of Jefferson as a Black woman. But I am who I am.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. That I agree that teachers shouldn't try to assume a sort of artificial impersonality or impartiality about things when they're teaching. I think that it's important to look at the classroom as a dynamic space. It's an experience for students and for the teacher, ideally, and it's a process, ideally, for the students and the teacher that involves, moving towards knowledge and understanding and empathy as well. And so I think that, as you put it, we all sort of come from different places and unique places, right? And there's where we come from, and then I think there's where we meet. Right, so we all might come from different places, but I think it's important in a classroom environment and a learning environment, particularly, that we meet at some point, right? Because I think there's a valuable expressive component to our personal experiences and background, and that's important. And then I think there's an important educative component to our personal experiences and background. And in the classroom, I think it's crucial that educative component be capitalized on, right? That we learn from each other and that we meet in a middle place, a common ground or something, though that doesn't overwhelm or obliterate our separate identities, but that now we sort of can understand that pathway better between where we've come from and where we meet, and we can traverse it, right, comfortably, and in a way that we're not afraid to meet with other people and converse with them and have common ground, but we also aren't afraid to be confident in who we are and our unique identity. So I think both are possible, and the classroom is a good space for that, to constantly be aware both of where we are coming from as a teacher or as a student, and not be afraid to express that, but also be attentive to where we're going to meet and learn together.
I just wanted to add really quickly that both of us think through metaphors a lot. Both of us do, especially you do a lot. But they're all really useful to help us think through these questions. And some years ago, I was having trouble trying to explain to some of my neighbors why empathy was important. You know, they felt they were being empathetic enough, but I wanted them to do a little bit more. And it was a difficult task for me as a Black woman to try and bring them along and so on. And then finally, I just thought, I said to them and developed this all into a TED Talk, but I thought of, okay, when is it that you all have privilege over me, and when do I have some privilege over you? And I came up with the metaphor of sunscreen. Like I never use sunscreen, and I know that you have to use sunscreen
every day,
right? But I don't.
Yeah.
But what would happen if I took that away from you? Like what you would suffer. Like you would. It would not be fun, right? And that's the way I got them to think about empathy. That empathy means that I think about about who you are, who I am, what you need to be full and whole and well, and what I need, and I make sure that you have what you need, understanding that I don't need everything that you need, So the sunscreen metaphor was helpful to get beyond our resistance to owning who we are, and to get to owning who we are, and recognizing that other people have different experiences that must be recognized and acknowledged for us to all come together on the train and keep going.
So I can imagine having a conversation with maybe high school students, maybe 11th and 12th graders, to say, I find this topic difficult to talk about. Would you suggest that same kind of, maybe it's vulnerability in the classroom when you're talking to 6th graders? Would it be a burden that's maybe too much for them to carry if I start to talk about, this is actually really difficult for me? Or do you think that the young can also need to hear that?
I think the young need to hear it. I think though that our generation has had time to, and has had a history of generations saying, this is too difficult, I don't want to talk about it, right? Or race and racism, it doesn't affect me, so I'm just not going to talk about it, or whatever iteration of that uncomfortableness is in the room. But I do think that at this time, we do need to put that behind us and say, this is going to be difficult for all of us, but this is our history, and we can do it. We do it carefully, we do it deliberately, we do it with great caution and care, but we have to do it. I'm not sure that starting the conversation with, this is difficult for me, is useful for our future. I think this is going to be difficult for all of us because it is a difficult history, but it is our full history.
Yeah, I agree. I think that too often, I think we do underestimate what young children are capable of processing and understanding, and that it is important to use. I really like the train metaphor, and I think in a classroom, it's especially relevant that the teacher and the students are in the same train car. They're on the same train, going the same direction, and so I think that's part of building a classroom rapport and of being together in the search for truth and mutual understanding and learning, to have that kind of vulnerability and to experience it and express it in a communal way as a classroom, I think is good. And I think that even at younger ages, that students are capable of handling that.
Maybe you have advice for the school administrators as well. I know that that's your role now. When we have a teacher, for example, who says, I can't teach about this topic because of my race, or I can't teach about this topic impartially, I must teach it personally, according to my ethnicity or my family history or my cultural identity. How does a school administrator, in love and sensitivity, help the teacher teach?
Well, I think that here, as we were saying with the idea of where one comes from versus where we meet in the classroom, I think that it is important for an administrator, would be important for the teacher to feel supported in teaching authentically. I think, and feeling empowered to teach authentically. So to not dissuade a teacher from expressing that in the classroom or teaching in a certain way because of where they're coming from personally, but then also being attentive again to where the students are coming from as well and how that will impact the students and where you will meet as a classroom in learning. So yeah, I think that would be important to empower the teacher to teach genuinely and authentically.
And I would just add that when we become teachers, educators in any way, this is the work that we have committed to participate in. We didn't choose to be engineers or some other profession. We chose to be educators. And so it is our responsibility to take it on. If we're teaching history, literature, anything in the humanities, liberal education, any of those fields under that umbrella, we have to do it all. I can't come to this work that we're doing and say, I'm Black, I just want to do Black stuff. If we're talking about American history, I just want to do it through Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I don't want to consider any of the other history if I'm talking about American history. Now, if I'm talking about African American history, I might be able to do that. Although even there, we do have to include what was Frederick Douglass up against? What was Du Bois dealing with? So we do have to bring context to everything. So as an administrator, if I had a young professor come in and say, look, I don't want to, I'm white, I grew up in Nebraska or wherever, right? And I just don't want to deal with that. I would say maybe find another job, because that's what we sign up for. Now I understand, especially in higher ed, we do specialize, so we do, focus in on, I do study Black music, but I've challenged myself to also consider what are the other kinds of music that have evolved as a result of Black music. There's rock and roll. I study Bruce Springsteen. What can we see in some of the other music that is out there? That has either impacted Black music. There are instruments that are used in jazz that came from Europe. There's some parallels between country music and soul music and so on that really gives a more robust picture of the history of Black music. So that's my long way of saying, do the work.
I have a metaphor for you, actually,
here we
following
go.
up on this. So I tend to think of this, and rightly or wrongly, but I tend to think of it as like tributaries of a river. What you were just describing, I think, more or less, where we're coming from is like a sort of a tributary that flows into a river that in some places we have in common with other people who are coming from different places. And so it's important to keep both of those in mind and to come from where you're coming from authentically and genuinely and in terms of background expertise, but to be aware of the river that other tributaries are also flowing into, and maybe that's the classroom or something. But that metaphor helps me to think about
Great
that.
metaphor.
Thank you.
I'm going to steal that one.
Well, I'd like to move to a little bit more modern conversation now and talk about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's evident when we look at the civil rights movement that injustice in our nation did not end in 1865. The civil rights movement generated competing factions that disagreed over how to right the wrongs of our nation's ongoing racial injustice. So how should we discuss the Black Panther movement or Malcolm X or the maybe radically different ideas of MLK?
It's another great question. The fact is that the civil rights movement was very important. It's a movement that we have, I think now at this point, put in most of our history books, right? But most of our history books, American history books, probably won't mention the Black Panthers, or if they do, they'll mention them in a way that is negative. Same with Malcolm X. Anything that's a little bit more radical doesn't sit well with many of our history books, and I think that's a problem. I think that we need to include as equally as possible. I know the civil rights movement was a big one because it included various groups and iconic people that we know about, Martin Luther King, and so on. But there was great work done by so many other groups along the way before the civil rights movement and leading out of it. So there was for example, a great literary movement called the Harlem Renaissance earlier in the 20th century that really made such wonderful moves, thinking as a humanist who studies art. That's a great way of thinking of what that work did to bring us to the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. And of course, music plays all the way through this. But let me not go there. Or maybe I can, right? So we think of the civil rights movement and we think of We Shall Overcome, these wonderful civil rights songs that really had an impact on folk music. So we hear it from Pete Seeger, we hear it from Bob Dylan, but this was music that civil rights activists were singing as they were marching, as they were sitting in, and so on. That's great. But we also have songs by people like Nina Simone, Curtis Mayfield, James Brown, that were a little bit more urgent, that said, we need to get up and get moving. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, get up everybody, it's time to get going. All of these all together are important. Even as we focus on the civil rights movement, we tend to focus only on Martin Luther King, but what about Diane Nash, who really helped organize a lot of that work that was done in the South? What about Rosa Parks? I know we mention her, but do we know what her own personal history was? What about people like Fannie Lou Hamer? I'm mentioning, of course, all the Black women because we typically have left them out. What about John Lewis? These are other people that we should be mentioning. We are too selective in the ways in which we retell our histories. I have great respect for the civil rights movement, but also for the Black Power movement, for the Black Panthers. What they did for their communities is completely radical and wonderful. So anyway, that's my spiel for bringing a wider lens to the histories that we tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that thoroughness and completeness is really important when teaching any of these movements, the civil rights movement, certainly also the abolitionist movement, or when teaching the American founding era. You have to not only teach, as I mentioned earlier, the Mount Rushmore version of the history, you have to teach it completely and thoroughly. I think actually the civil rights movement is probably one of the most egregious examples of the Mount Rushmore approach, not giving a complete and full picture and not educating students as thoroughly as they should be. So the Martin Luther King Jr. Monument in Washington, D.C. is actually amazing and incredible. I recommend it to anybody. But he was not the only important figure in the civil rights movement, and it's important not to lose the contributions of other people and other parts of the civil rights movement, which haven't gone away, right? So even though Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of the civil rights movement is what we now teach about primarily in schools and talk about, the other aspects of the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, and that's still their ideas and their approach and their activism, that's still relevant today, and neglecting it is only to our detriment, I think. I'll add to Stephanie's list of overlooked figures, and there are many. Ida B. Wells, I think, as a forerunner of the civil rights movement, extremely important. I can't overstate how important she was to the civil rights movement ultimately, and the light that she threw on the practice of lynching through her journalism. Frederick Douglass praises her in a preface to her pamphlet and says that she did more for the cause of racial equality and justice than he himself thinks he ever ever did. So, but she's forgotten to most textbooks, and most students don't know who she is. It's nice when I have undergraduates to be able to surprise them with something that they've never heard before and see their eyes light up, and that's great. But I'd rather if that didn't happen when I mentioned Ida Wells or Malcolm X, right, and his contribution to the civil rights movement. I'd rather if they had some sort of grounding in the full picture of these movements.
And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention other movements that have carried on, like the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that have fought for the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and those that are still on the margins of power and economic and social mobility.
Well, I'd like to end our conversation today by looking at one of the philosophical pillars of Great Hearts. And at Great Hearts, we agree with Plato, and we say that the end, the telos of education, is to be good, morally and intellectually good. So I'm wondering, in light of the conversation we've had today, how do conversations like this, talking about sensitive topics in our history, help us become good? How do these conversations help us become better citizens and more loving neighbors?
Okay.
Yeah, let's keep going.
We both want to do this
Yeah.
this question. We both want to jump in. This is why we do the work that we do. We feel we met at a time and at an institution where these were the questions. Our campus needs work. Our students don't feel welcome. We, as a society, our students, we met at the University of Missouri. Our students the University of Missouri's just 2 hours out of Ferguson, and the Mike Brown situation happened, that murder happened there. And on campus, students were still being called the N-word and so on. Adam and I met at that point, and we could have continued doing our work in our silos. At the time, I think I was chair of the Department of Black Studies. I had lots of things that I could keep busy with. And Adam was associate director of a major institute at Mizzou. And so we could have just kept going in our different tributaries. And so I think we met over lunch and we started talking and we said, let's sit down and figure out a class that we could both teach, and we'll invite others to teach so that we can help our institution heal. And that's where Race and the American Story was born. We were committed to the notion that knowledge can take us to the promised land. That deep knowledge that students participate in, not that we lecture and we leave, but that we allow our students to see these primary documents that frame the way race has been talked about and defined in American history, that our students would themselves find their way to new revelations and new ways of thinking about their dorm, the folks on their dorm, the floors of their dorms. They would find a different reaction to their classmates who are doing terrible things. They would be able to step up and say, hey, that's actually not who we are, and that's not what our values are. So this is good work. This is, John Lewis says, it's good trouble. It's trouble because it's hard work. Like, why are we even troubling the waters like that? But it's important. We need to get in there and wade in it and bring others along with us. So it's good.
Yeah, it's hard to add to that. I think that was really well said, that the Race and the American Story project we started it to do good. That was the goal, I think, right? That it was certainly to educate, to further knowledge, but for the sake of doing good and bringing about good for our community. So I think that's absolutely right. I think that in education today, and in K-12 education, particularly also higher education, I think that there's too much fear of doing something wrong or doing the wrong thing or doing something bad or, and not enough positive energy of doing good, right? Of doing the right thing and doing something good. And I think that would be helpful to remind ourselves of the goal of education being to bring about the good for ourselves and for our neighbors and for our community as a positive goal. And that when we teach about sensitive topics, difficult issues, history of race in America, that we really should embrace that. We shouldn't shy away from it. We should embrace it as a way of doing good for our community. Teaching and educating about these topics, we are bringing about the good for our communities. And so I think that's important as an attitude, certainly. And I think it's great to think of education generally that way, as being directed not only to knowledge, but also then to the good, to being moved to act on the basis of your knowledge.
Any last little pieces of advice for our teachers?
Get in there, let's go. It's time. I think it's time. And I think if we're thinking of liberal education, if we're thinking of history and literature and art, more than any other field in the academy, these are the fields that will take us further. These are the fields that allow us to really rethink our journey. And this is important work. I know it doesn't often feel that way. It often feels that the focus is on STEM education. That's what the society seems to privilege. But none of those fields, whether it's science, technology, engineering, or math, none of them have had any great strides without a humanist lens on the questions. What are the questions that allow us to think about good health care and pharmaceutical questions and products and so on? Are they fairly thought through for all of us? In terms of technology, are we thinking about the different kinds of people that you need to frame and light up, in the way we use our technology, our algorithms? All of that have to start with humanist questions.
Yeah, I'd agree that just to say to teachers that your work is extremely important, and that we live in a society that unfortunately doesn't appropriately and accurately value the importance of the work that people do, and our economic system doesn't assign wages and salaries and prestige in proportion to the importance of the work, because certainly the work that teachers do, as in the case of other jobs and professions and walks of life as well, is much more important than it is valued by the society, and it deserves all the gratitude and support that we can give it. So that, and then also just to have courage and not be afraid and embrace the education of your students in every aspect, and realize the importance and the sacredness really of the classroom space and the wonderful service that you're doing for our country.
Maybe we should all get little flowers, the white flower that Billie Holiday wore, as a reminder that we need to get in there and do it, but gently.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tammy.